Well, it's great to see you all here. Welcome back. Those of you who have been here before and those of you who are new, welcome. This is a series of lectures trying to understand the notion of learning and doing and looking for a way of trying to unify our notions of rationality in both the narrow sense of reasoning and in the broad sense of being responsive to reasons, and desire, belief, and action. Okay, let me announce first off that I'm afraid there won't be a seminar tomorrow. I've got to travel, but we'll resume the following week, so keep your burning questions until then. These are just some images to tease you. The question is, what do these things have in common? And I hope by the end of the talk you'll have a good answer. This is a robotic spider. This is a mouse in a maze. That's a map of rods and cones on your retina. This is a final position in a go board. And that is, well, it's interesting to ask what that is. It looks like a face. Okay, so I can begin with a quote from William James on thinking and doing. And I learned from being with psychologists that you get extra points if you can quote William James at the beginning of a lecture. And since he wrote so much on so many questions, it's actually relatively easy to find a quote of William James that works, but this one seems to work. So he wrote, "My thinking is first and last and always for my doing." And that makes evolutionary sense. Mother Nature doesn't care what your score on the SAT is. What matters is how you translate whatever representations you might form into action, and so your thinking should be oriented toward action. Now, he might have added, and all of my doing stretches forward and not backward in time, and so that means that thinking for doing is prospective thinking, and so we should expect that prospection is a fundamental mode of operation of the mind. And I'm going to try to convince you of that. Well, here's today's roadmap. It's on your handout, so I won't repeat it. I hope to get through it. And with all the assembled philosophical horsepower in this room, I will indeed benefit a great deal if I can. I do want to mention, though, something I learned this morning opening my granola box. It gave me the injunction, try something you might fail at. You'll be prepared to fail, so you cannot lose. Is that a valid inference? As my son likes to say, what could go wrong? Right? Okay, so begin with a little bit of review. Our project is building up to something recognizable as acting for a reason from parts that we can independently understand and that can provide some kind of explanation of how it's possible to be responsive to reasons, so that we need not treat such phenomena as acting for a reason as somehow unanalyzed primitives, or presuppose it, let's say, in our very attempt to understand it. And that's, again, the injunction from my morning cereal. Thus far, we have developed notions of desire and belief that have sufficient functional structure to underwrite many of the properties that we normally attribute to acting intentionally. We saw how belief and desire working in concert could result in a case of acting under a representation with a desirability characteristic, such that there would be an answer to the question, what is she doing and why? Even if the agent didn't know the answer, there would be an answer. The answer's representation is what gives a satisfaction condition for the action. The action is bound together over time by that representational content, and the motivation is via that representation toward an end. So it has a teleological structure, and it is intelligible because it represents a desirability characteristic, because it orients the agent's activity around that and guides it through the course of the action and its parts. We can see how the agent sees things, what she's concerned about, what she values. We can see that in the action, and so it becomes intelligible. We also saw a convergence between that picture that I was drawing, those pictures, and some contemporary work in decision theory and model-based learning and control. Desire and belief by their nature incorporate the features of having decision weights for us. There's an effective common currency on a shared route from belief to and desire to action. They spontaneously project, and therefore they yield contentful action-guiding expectations. They have spontaneous regulation of action-oriented resources like motivation, attention, reliance, and so on. And so in that sense, they're regulative. They also spontaneously monitor action outcomes. And so we have dual paths of feedback from them, and they're capable of spontaneous learning, that is, of updating the strength of preference or the strength of confidence by discrepancy with outcomes. And so this is the picture. You can see each one of them. They have a parallel structure. Each involves an effective state that is oriented toward a representation that makes one have either a positive attitude toward or a degree of confidence in some object, that regulates either focused motivation or focused reliance, generates some kind of an effective prediction or just a prediction of state. That can be compared with the actual outcome, and that can give you feedback by these two loops that we've described. So that's how these two work together to organize action around a representation that is both one that you have some confidence in and one that you have some desirability toward. Okay, so what about the phenomenon that we need to get to today, which is I'm going to argue that we need skill in dealing with reasons, and I'm going to start off with skill in implicit deliberation. Now, I really don't want to legislate language. I have in mind, when I'm talking about the way in which these states capture a lot of what we incorporate into acting intentionally, I don't mean to legislate there. I mean, for example, to be using the relatively weaker notion of acting intentionally rather than acting on the basis of a preformed intention. The way that, for example, I've intentionally made the verbs in my sentences agree with their subjects, even though I never formed an intention to do so over the last 5 minutes, versus actually forming an intention as a conscious matter and holding myself to it as a conscious matter, which presumably for verb agreement is rare among fluent speakers, but quite common among novice speakers. So I have in mind the weaker notion, but what I need to explain really is how it's possible to be guided by a representation for the sake of an end in steps bound together over time. That's really the thing I need to explain, and I need to explain it without invoking some kind of a self-consciously formed and deployed prior intention in order to avoid launching us on a regress. And so I think of this in, for example, fluent speech. Now, if we have this notion of a capacity of this kind, then we could offer an explanation of how it is possible to self-consciously form and be guided by a prior intention as itself an intentional activity without needing to self-consciously form and be guided by an intention to do it. So we would have the necessary purposivity and so on to have the intentional activity of forming an intention. It would be an intelligent disposition, but it would not require to be regulated by a predisposition, a pre-formed intention. Now, many of you may be happier with reserving terms like action or acting intentionally for the special case in which there's a propositional object in play. And so wherever I say action or intentional action or acting intentionally, you can substitute purposive behavior, or last time, as I argued, you can substitute something like acting intelligently. Those would all be fine for my purposes. What I'm trying to do is build up to something, not claim at any one point that I've made it, but just that I've gotten progress along the way. So our ultimate goal, and I do care whether we get there, is to characterize an infrastructure that is aptly responsive to reasons so that things like reasoning and forming intentions and so on can be more than just narrowly rational, that is, more than just exercises in internal coherence, capable then of being broadly rational, that is, responsive to reasons, and able to do so in the very distinctive way and important way that self-conscious reasoning can. And so today what we're going to discuss are some of those ways, and we're going to try to say how that infrastructure gives us a certain skill. It's a skill with reasons and reasoning that we need in order to do this. And so here are some examples of failures of skill in reasons and reasoning. So Williams's famous example of one thought too many, when the Kantian or utilitarian, seeing his wife and the captain drowning outside of the lifeboat, has to do either a utility calculation or a categorical imperative in order to decide whether to rescue the wife. That's one thought too many. This person lacks a certain skill in dealing with reasons of love. An athlete might be self-conscious. He might be interfering, therefore, with his or her own performance. I remember beginning bowling and thinking to myself, now, if only I can align my hand with the alleyway, then I can get the ball to go down. It won't always go in the gutter. And after an hour or so of throwing the ball in the gutter, I realized what I had to do was look where the ball was supposed to go. So self-conscious, deliberate interference with one's own performance. There's Kant's reasoner, who demands a rule for applying a rule, a concept for applying a concept, and therefore launches an infinite regress. There's Burden's ass, who gets stuck between two alternatives because the reasons equal out. There's Aristotle's would-be reasoner, who demands a demonstration for every step in the demonstration, including the first principles. There's our friend, the tortoise, talking with Achilles, convincing him not to try to make an inference rule a premise. There's Hume's self-defeating skeptic, who actually ends up undermining his own conclusion, his own argument, and his own reasoning by, as Hume says, putting him into a situation of utter darkness, unable to rely even upon the feeble bit of reasoning that's left to him. But also ditherers who let opportunities pass from their inability to let go of an opportunity. That's a kind of a lack of skill with reasons that I often have. And then the various forms of practical regress we've discussed. So these are all individuals who render themselves less aptly responsive to reasons and may even place reasoning itself outside of their grasp by lacking a certain intelligence and competence in deploying self-conscious deliberation and decision at the right time, in the right way, toward the right objects, with the right end, to invent a phrase. Okay, so let's take a quick walk through an example. Suppose that someone proposes not to rely upon his senses and faculties without deciding that they're reliable. He says, I need to have a reason for doing this. I need to decide on the basis of some evidence and some reasoning that I can trust these faculties. And so there he sits, unable to gain any evidence or unable to engage in any reasoning because he lacks anything that would count as evidence or reasoning on their behalf. Well, what can this person do? This person could extend a measure of default defeasible trust in his senses and faculties. That would be without evidence. That would be not as a result of reasoning, not as a result of a justification, but it would begin to give him sensory evidence. It would begin to give him reasoning. And he can, if he systematically relies upon the evidence he receives and the reasoning that he does and tries to intervene in the world on that basis, that will give him feedback. And over time, he can learn to be more discriminating in what he relies upon and how heavily he does. Okay, and my claim is that that's what belief and desire do. They're set up in that way to make us launch out into the world, apply what we want and believe to the world, and therefore discover through interaction with the world and interaction with others where it is that we need refinement in our thinking. And they commit action-oriented resources, and so they set us up for failure in a way that's an interesting way, in a way that matters to us because, of course, it matters whether our motivations are fulfilled, and that motivates us to pay attention and learn. And as we saw, infants display this kind of active expectation-based learning from very early on, even in learning the frequencies of phonemes in language or in separating language sounds from the background sound in their environment. So the desires and beliefs, we don't have to think that they are the reasons. Having this kind of default defeasible deference or trust is not saying that the belief and the desire themselves are reasons. It may be the fact that the belief reports or the goal that the desire aims at that gives you reasons. I'm much more happy with that way of talking. But the point is that by giving some default defeasible trust or deference to these states, one can get on with the process of living and learning, trial and error. Okay, so being skilled with epistemic reasons isn't just something that the infant or the individual does on their own typically. You could have the same problem with other people. You say, I'm not going to rely on anything that comes from another person until I got evidence that that person is reliable. Well, we would need to, for example, trust some of the things that that individual says to see where it is that they might lead us. And so to get feedback from others, we also have to rely to some extent on others. And again, infants do this, but if we watch over time, they become more discriminating in which adults they rely upon, for what purposes, food preference, behavior, word use, and so on. Okay, so this is just an example of an experiment that was run, this time with adults. The adults were playing a game with another person in which the other person was either being trustworthy or untrustworthy, and they were making judgments about that. And as you can see, the dotted line represents the actual trustworthiness or untrustworthiness of the individual in terms of the probability that they're giving a correct answer. And then the colored lines represent the estimates that they had of that. And so they track it pretty well. Okay, so these are, I'm claiming, active, intelligent, and prospective action tendencies. Last time we looked briefly at the good regulator theorem of Conant and Ashby. Recall, a good regulator of a system is going to build a model of the system. And they themselves speculate on that basis that the living brain, insofar as it is to be successful and efficient as a regulator for survival, must proceed in learning by the formation of a model or models. Now, I don't want to put too much weight on that particular result. It has its own assumptions and so on. What I'd rather point to is the considerable consensus today in control theory that intelligent systems must have or build causal evaluative models and use them in simulation and active control and learn through some kind of feedback. This is something that's taken a while to converge upon, but it's become now quite a common belief about the possibility of designing systems that can move and act intelligently. Last time we also reviewed some evidence from cognitive and affective neuroscience that intelligent animals like rats and monkeys do indeed construct spatial and causal evaluative models through experience, that they use such models to simulate possibilities in advance, including the generation of novel possibilities, and they're actively guided by them in real-time decisions. So we saw, for example, this phenomenon of hippocampal replay of a maze that's been explored during the day. We noted that the exploration doesn't just reflect the frequency with which the rat visited parts of the maze. Indeed, it spends more time activating parts that it spent less time in during the day. It activates in directions it didn't travel. And over time, it even starts constructing shortcuts, what are effectively shortcuts in the maze. And when it's in real-time decision-making, for example, here is the rat having gone up the center channel of that maze. It is sitting at this choice point right now, which is a point at which it's been rewarded or not. Sitting at this choice point here. It's going to be difficult. So much for that. Sitting at that choice point, you can see that activation in the representation sweeps first to the right. You see that there is a certain degree of activation there down that arm. It sweeps then to the left. There is a smaller degree of activation down that arm. This all takes place within hundreds of milliseconds. And so what's happening is the rat sitting at the choice point in the maze, even before it's begun its trip down one or the other arm, is sweeping forward and backward. And in these mazes, often they design them so there's a point between the reward and the choice point where the rat has made its decision and is on the way to the reward, and there's a little click that it will hear if there is food because the food tray opens. And what happens if the rat goes to the left here and doesn't hear the click is before it goes all the way to the food tray, it starts projecting backwards behind it and reverses direction to go down the other arm of the maze. So they're, in that sense, projecting and deliberating. They're looking at alternatives, weighing the values associated with them, and deciding on that basis. So action then extends into the future, and therefore we can't simply rely upon perception and memory and action. We have to actively generate possible futures, explore them and evaluate them, and act in light of them if we're going to efficiently and effectively interact with the world. And this creates pressure on us to develop models that have a degree of generality, that have a degree of projectability and abstraction to types of situations, because the more generality you can get, the more effectively you can predict, the less information that you need in order to predict. And so pushing for abstraction and generality is actually part of the process of perspection itself. Now, it's been tempting to think in terms of two kinds of mental processes, the so-called personal deliberative system 2 and the subpersonal automatic system 1. System 2 can do logic and reasoning and statistics, and System 1 does heuristics and push-button responses. But as we've seen, the subpersonal can be highly deliberative. It's just subpersonally deliberative. And you might just say, well, these are just causal dispositions. They're not under the direct control of a self-conscious agent. Perhaps so. We don't know much about the self-consciousness of a rat. But what they do is to approximate the form and principles of rational choice theory and Bayesian belief revision. And so in that sense, the rat's reliance upon them is purposive, intelligent, and warranted in rat terms. Okay, so here's the brain I was brought up on, maybe you too. We start off with the brain stem and the cerebellum, this reptilian part of the brain. Adults were always telling us, kids, don't act with the reptilian part of your brain. Then there was the subcortex, the so-called mammalian part of the brain, and sitting on top of that was this ultimate achievement, the primate and human cortex. And so the cerebellum and brainstem did automatic responses. The limbic system did non-cognitive emotion, and the cortex did rational thought. And that was the picture that we had, and that's why you weren't supposed to think with your reptilian brain, or you weren't supposed to behave like an animal. On the other hand, on today's picture, it's much more like the following. The cerebellum actually does model-based planning of complex motor sequences. The mammalian parts of the brain actually do estimations of probability and value. They do deliberation and rational decision-making. And the cortex does a representation of these complex hierarchical predictive models. And so in that sense, then, looking at the brain, we can see how it could be that mammals are intelligent as they are, and how it is that we could improve upon them because we can build much more powerful models and therefore conduct our behavior in a much more directive and promising and long-term and accomplishing sort of way. Okay, so the perspective brain, then, it doesn't wait for some stimulus in order to act or learn. We talk about dispositions as if the brain sort of sat there with a disposition waiting for some stimulus to hit it. But as we saw in the case of a rat, rats actively discriminate among stimuli for the most predictive cues. They do representationally based offline simulation, which plays a very important role in their learning. They focus on possibilities with the greatest information value. They're not just acting from habit. Simulation also plays an active role in their real-time behavior. Their thinking runs ahead of the situation. They project and assess possibilities to guide action selection. So these are dispositions, but they're not dispositions that are passive, waiting around as latent states to be triggered. They're forms of engagement with the world, exploration for information, imagining possibilities, using these processes to build action-guiding models, and noticing and seeking out opportunities to realize desires or meet needs. Because the realization of these states, these beliefs and desires, is effective, that means that they not only have the character of tracking value and uncertainty, but they do that in a manner that can coordinate the operation of attention, perception, memory, inference, motivation, and monitoring of action. So in this sense, then, they are agents in all of those ways, and whether we call that agency or not, they're certainly not passive, and they're not passive in response to their dispositions. They're engaged in intelligent, implicit, goal-directed behavior. And here's the robotic spider, finally. This was a little simple robot that was built. No one told it how to walk. All they did was program it with a cost function, which said it costs you something not to be moving to the right. And then it gave it the capacity to effectuate these little arms and use feedback. And over time, what it started doing was what babies do, this kind of motor babbling like this. And eventually things started to happen. Moving this arm this way caused it to move a little bit. It sensed that. Moving this arm this way moved it back. It didn't want to do that. And over time, what it learned to do is a very crummy kind of way of sliding and pushing itself sideways across the table. And it did that by building a little model of its limbs and using that in order to regulate its behavior. So that's perhaps how we learn our own body map as infants. Now, how important are these perspective processes? This is perhaps a diagram familiar to most of you. These are the cones and rods of your retina. The cones are sensitive to color. The rods are sensitive to light. They're especially sensitive to low light. As you'll see, there's a hole where your blind spot is, but there's obviously no hole in your visual field. Something is filling that in. Moreover, almost all of your color perception, and actually almost all of your high accuracy perception, is centered right around the fovea, right at the center of focus. And as it goes out to the edges, there's less and less color sensation, less and less detail. Now, if you look at this room, if you look at the world in front of you, it doesn't look like that. It's not as if there were this clear center with color, and then there's this sort of mush going out to the sides, basically gray or dark or light. Instead, you've got full color, and you've got what seems to be high resolution all around. How do we do that? Well, the same way we fill in the blind spot. We do it via building models of the world, statistical models, and using the information that we do get from the eye, from the center of the eye, and from the quick eye movements, using that plus the statistical relations that we've learned about the world to project the rest, and that way we manage the information problem. There's no need for the organism to sense information that it could already predict. It would soon overwhelm its capacity if it took in the entire visual field and pumped all of that, tried to pump all of that into the brain. And so as a matter of information theoretic economy, what the brain does is to construct a lot of your visual field, and it does it extremely well. I recently got glasses that have graduated focal length, and for the first several days there was a little bit swimming when I moved my head. It stopped doing that now. My brain managed to rewire that very nicely. Okay, now here's an example of this idea of generality. So if we look at the visual system, what we'll see is at the first layer you start getting things that look like edges, then you start getting things that look like intersections of edges, and then you start getting features that look a bit like faces, or maybe a reasonable amount like faces. And so what's happening is, because the model is trying to generate the external environment, what it's doing is it's trying to develop the most predictive features it can, so that if it's in a world with lots of faces, or in this case, if the internet world where there are lots of cats, well, what it does is it takes information that's a corner or a part of a face, and therefore can project outward from that to fill in the rest of the face without your needing to sense it. And what's interesting is if you build artificial systems, artificial neural nets, and turn them loose on this internet data, they do something very similar. The first layers construct edges, then they start constructing features, then you start getting things like faces, and that's where that mysterious-looking face emerges that we saw at the beginning. Okay, what about the default network? I haven't really said much about what's going on in the brain for perspection, and this is your phrenology alert. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say something about the architecture of the brain, and I recognize that that is always met with a very justifiably high degree of skepticism. This part of the brain lights up, and therefore, right, that's not either good science or good philosophy. This is not quite phrenology, or at least it's phrenology 2.0, because we're looking not at areas of the brain as such, but at interacting areas, functionally organized, relatively stable networks of interaction in the brain. And among them, there are two primary such systems. There is a task-oriented system, and there's what's called the default network. And the default network is active when you're not actively focusing on a particular task. It's active in the brief moments that your mind is wandering. As you're listening to me talk, it's constantly wandering in and coming back. The default system is active when it's doing that. It's active when you're in a rest state. It's active when you're in REM sleep. And so there's the default system. Now, this is a very metabolically expensive thing to maintain. Even in this so-called resting state, it's consuming about 15 to 20% of your body's oxygen and calories, despite constituting such a small amount of your body weight. Moreover, the level of metabolic activity in the brain between task and default state is relatively constant. So you're not resting, you're not gathering forces for the focused attention later, you're doing something that requires a great deal of energy and that involves this complicated set of interconnections that are part of the default system. So what is it doing? Well, over the last decade or decade and a half, it's emerged that the default system is strongly associated with autobiographical memory. So this is your memory for specific events and their interrelationships. It's also interesting to note, this is a close tie to perspection. Memory, we know, is labile, it's flexible. If the job of memory were to create an archive such that we have an authentic representation of the past, this would be a tremendous flaw in your memory system. When you call a memory up and do some work with it, you actually change it and restore it with improvements. So why would memory be built like that? And the answer is it's not built to give you a perfect record of the past. But if you were trying to build up a database that would be relevant to what's going to go on in the future, then you would indeed use new information and new thought to update your memory system. And indeed, what Binder and Desai found is that this task of envisioning the future is accomplished in a very similar network to the task of autobiographical memory. Indeed, they're functionally organized in such a way that they're tightly interrelated with one another. We can pull episodes out of the past, recombine them in various ways, and envision the future. That's what our rat was doing in REM sleep. pulling episodes out of the past, reassembling them in various ways, and envisioning possibilities. Well, what else does the default system do? Well, what's the most important context most of us inhabit most of the time, certainly when we're giving talks? That is to say, a social context. It's very important to understand the people around us, to size up the social situation. Are people starting to stare at the ceiling? Are they beginning to pull out their phones and look secretly underneath the tables? Are they actually following with their eye gaze? I have to size that up, and I need to keep sizing that up throughout the course of a talk. So I need to monitor not only my own interactions with others, but third-party interactions. And so another thing that the default system does very actively is theory of mind, filling in your representation of the mental states of those around you. And again, this is an interesting fact that you use your capacity to envision the future for your theory of mind. And what's been found is that people are actually more reliable at predicting people's emotions and so on than they are at predicting their behaviors. Okay, so skill, I'm going to claim, combines this kind of intelligence with what we're going to call fluency. What is fluency? Fluency is the capacity to use all of this intelligence, these complicated models of the world, and to do so without having to engage in conscious, self-conscious deliberation and control and intervention. So think about how we learn and we use language. You're learning a new language. You've already got an existing one to scaffold on. You spend a lot of time representing rules or regularities in the language. Once you get good at that language, you stop doing it. Well, that's what it is to be fluent in that language. And it doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to the rules or norms. It doesn't mean you've got some kind of a simple knee-jerk reaction. I trust you don't. You're still engaged in conversation. You're better at conversation than you were before. You're more capable of responding to the conversational and social situation around you. And so there's another thing that the default system is strongly correlated with, and that's our general semantic network that we're using for encoding and decoding meanings. And so there's a picture of an integrated set of systems that are involved with memory, envisioning the future, theory of mind, and meaning, and this is in a prospective setting, which makes perfectly good sense. Okay, so let's talk about skill in self-conscious deliberation. I promise we're going to get to this. Self-conscious deliberation in action. Psychologists like to study elite athletes. I assume it's a very nice way to get to know people that you've admired for years. And what they discover is that elite athletes aren't just sort of born that way. They've practiced thousands of hours, often thousands of hours more than very good athletes. But they don't just do it with their bodies. They also do it perceptually, and they do it imaginatively. And so studies of elite athletes indicate that they mentally rehearse and revisit more extensively than very good athletes, the experiences they've had. They attend to different features of a game situation. They gather more information from them. They're able to predict the next event more rapidly and more accurately on the basis of a smaller set of cues. They can adjust their responses on the fly. Their movements are less predictable than the movements of extremely good athletes who are not elite athletes. They're more dynamically variable. And that's the advantage that an elite athlete has over very good players. They're more predictable than he or she is, and they're therefore in a position to take advantage of that small amount of advantage in terms of their own unpredictability and the other's predictability. Okay, so here's the picture. Skill in humans, like playing tennis, is a model-based control system. You have a controller, it generates a forward model, it predicts what the current state's going to be, it compares that with the desired state, it then generates a new control command and so on. And so the model-based picture of control seems to be what lies behind the great skill of intelligent and elite athletes. Okay, so skill then combines intelligence and fluency in bringing together multiple factors and translating them into appropriate action. Now, that's a kind of deliberation. Typically, there are multiple variables at stake in any game situation. You've got to coordinate with others. There are various possible forms of advantage or loss. There are degrees of confidence and risk in the situation, utilization of scarce resources. How hard are you going to run after that ball if it's just going out of bounds, and so on. And so at the highest level of accomplishment, you need to be able to reliably estimate these values and compare them and put them in some kind of a pathway toward action that is also a pathway toward attention and the regulation of your behavior. And so in that sense, these elite athletes then are having to do, in a way that is fluent, a kind of continuous deliberative task. They're weighing considerations, and they're doing that without extensive conscious intervention. And so this is intelligent behavior. It's deliberative behavior in the sense that it's weighing reasons and selecting actions in some appropriate way. It's not muscle memory. That doesn't seem to be the way that elite athletes work. It's causal, but it's not merely causal. Okay, so one example that we saw of this kind of skilled, fluent behavior was the rat in the maze. In just a second, it was sweeping out the possibilities before it, assigning values to them, and regulating its action accordingly. That's a kind of fluency in behavior. Here's a model of how such deliberation, this implicit deliberation works. You have information coming in of different weights. It's competing here in the center scene between two dopamine neurons. Each stream of information is trying to inhibit the other stream. Each one's trying to gain an advantage over it. And what you've got is a system that's sitting in the central state here, and it could move either to the right or to the left into those potential troughs. And so what's happening is, as that competition continues, as one state grows, it inhibits the other one more effectively, it increases its advantage, and you hop to one side or the other. Now, you might think such a system is that's just a causal process, that somewhere inside the brain there's just this little causal process going on. But it's a causal process in which action comes from thought, because what's feeding into the system are intelligent, acquired representations of situations, information about options and values at stake. What's going into the decision, therefore, is contentful, and the decision that comes out is going to depend upon the content that went in. The word intelligence, in fact, comes from a root that means something like gathering. And what an intelligent animal is doing, let's say a foraging animal, is gathering that kind of information continuously and making decisions about whether to stay on a given patch or to go off and explore elsewhere. And we've seen that that can produce optimal foraging. Okay, now a delivery of that kind you might think is vulnerable to the bird and ass problem, right? If it's just weighing up considerations, if the considerations are equal on both sides, then it's going to get stuck, and indeed it would, except for the fact that neurons are chancy. They don't fire with 100% reliability, and so there's a kind of randomness in the system. And what's interesting, thinking about this model here, is that there's a certain random chance that it's going to hop to the side that isn't the most heavily weighted. And that's a way in which, in ordinary action, it can, for example, be unpredictable to prey, but it also can, in a bird and ass situation, get out of a trough that it would otherwise be stuck in. And again, it's not as if we have a better solution to bird and ass. Even if you form an intention and a resolve to go to one hay bale rather than the other, you've got to break the symmetry. How did you get that intention? Something in you has got to break that equality, and that something has got to be something that's related to the equal value of the two states involved. Okay, so skilled activity, I'm claiming, is the agent acting through a body of knowledge and capacities and competencies to achieve ends that she cares about in light of things that she values, that such activity is guided by an evaluative representation. It's not blind. It is fluent. It's attentive to the situation and responsive to features. And we can indeed learn and understand, once we're conscious agents, the many reasons why responding to certain kinds of reasons, like many of the reasons in an athletic event, do require this kind of fluency if we are to respond aptly to them. And so this, I claim, is a model of skill with reasons. These are individuals who are skilled with the kinds of reasons that arise in the kinds of situations they face as athletes day in and day out. So I'm just going to give you an example now of a very ordinary kind of deliberation, and we'll see if some of these features are at work there. Okay, so this is the example of Ada and Bruce. Ada's been off on vacation. Bruce, her cat, has been at home. She had a friend taking care of Bruce. Her friend didn't notice, but Bruce had taken to lingering very near the front door while Ada was away. And so when Ada comes home, she's got her luggage and so on. She opens the door, and there's Bruce right there. She almost trips over him. She goes to her bedroom, puts down the luggage, and then she thinks, wait a second. If Bruce is hanging out near the door, he's going to get stepped on it. Well, that thought came from somewhere. That thought stopped her in her tracks. She didn't unpack her bags. She went into the front hall and began thinking how to get Bruce not to do this. Well, she thinks, in the kitchen I've got my water spray, right? And so she's a humane person, but she knows cats don't like water spray. And so what she does when she's got to discourage Bruce is to give him a little squirt of water. But how is Bruce going to associate the squirt of water with the specific kind of harm that would come from being stepped on? So she thinks, maybe that wouldn't work. And another thought comes to her. Maybe she could simulate coming in the door and stepping on Bruce's tail. And she could do that carefully enough that Bruce would get the message, because she could probably control her footstep and not apply too much pressure to Bruce's tail. Again, where did that idea come from? Out of all the things that she could have done, that idea came to her. Well, I think she's skilled at understanding Bruce and understanding the cat psychology of the situation. And so that's what she does. She fakes as if she were not looking. She steps on Bruce's tail as she goes to the door to take something out. Bruce cries out and runs away, and that solves the problem with Bruce. Okay, so there's a mixture of things that occurred to her, thoughts that she had, things that she noticed, things that stopped her in her tracks, ways in which some things seemed plausible to her, other things didn't, something that caused her to rethink at some point, something that settled her mind eventually. And those are all skills in deliberation, but of course she didn't have to deliberate about each and every one of those in order to have the thoughts occur to her, the memories, the associations, the model of Bruce's psychology, and so on. Okay, so they're parts of her deliberation, but they're not products of deliberation, and they evidence her skill in working with Bruce. Moreover, we can see that her deliberation was responsive to these reasons in an apt way. It was appropriately responsive to them, and we can see Ada in that decision. This is the kind of person Ada is, you can think, having watched that situation as we were able to watch it, staring over her shoulder. So I claim she's showing skill in deliberation and attention. She's not an elite athlete, but what she's doing is showing everyday ordinary skill in dealing with a situation where there are an infinite number of possible ways of contending with it, an infinite number of possible thoughts, but she manages to form reasonable thoughts in relevant ways, assign plausible weights, and come to some kind of a conclusion that actually works relatively well. And it's not opaque to her. She can't tell us the process by which she did all this, but it's not as if it were just happening to her and she thought, why would I ever have that idea occur in my head? So she's not like Quinn's Radio Man, to go back to our first lecture. Okay, well, let's talk about causal deviance briefly. Does this model help us at all with that? Well, here's a slightly different scenario. Ada's busy having this thought, and she comes up with this great idea. I'm going to mimic stepping on his tail, and that will give Bruce the message. And she doesn't notice that while she's doing that, Bruce has come up and is right next to her leg. And so she says, she comes to this conclusion, I'm going to walk to the door and step lightly on Bruce's tail, and she starts to walk to the door and steps on Bruce's tail. Okay, now she does it pretty hard this time. Bruce definitely gets the message, and he goes skedaddling off. Well, she accomplished her purpose. Her beliefs and her desires caused her to act in a way that accomplished her purpose. So is that a case of intentional action? If the belief-desire model says when the beliefs and the desires cause you to act in a way that realizes your desires relative to your beliefs, then that should be intentional action. But we know that what's missing in that story is that her behavior wasn't actually under the control of her representation of the situation. It wasn't the manner in which she represented the situation or the values at stake. That's why she was surprised. That's why it astonished her that she'd stepped on Bruce's tail in that way. And that's why she didn't regulate the pressure with which her foot was applied to Bruce's tail. And so, true, her beliefs and desires caused the action. True, the action satisfied her desires relative to her situation. But they did it in a way that wasn't the way in which her model-based control system had cooked up. And that's why it's an anomalous or devious causal chain. And we can apply similar kinds of analyses to Davidson's climber, to Oedipus on the road, and so on. Okay, now, do I want to stand here and claim, oh, we can solve the problem of deviant causal chains? No, any process has got deviant versions of it. The question is, can we get a little further in some insight into why this process is a non-intentional process by the kind of model that we've been using here, and what would count in such a case as causation in the right way, causation under the control of the representation that she has of the situation and what's at stake. Okay. This might be of interest. Davidson originally sought to rescue the belief-desire model, thinking that you could get the structure of acting from belief and desire. But he had a brief career in psychology, which he eventually quit, because he came to the view that there wasn't any way in which they could, on the strength of the techniques they did, have any kind of a meaningful separation of the beliefs and desires of the agent. They had the behavior. How do they know that the preferences have changed or that they're the same? How do they know which behaviors are due to preference versus probability? And so he thought this could never be a science, because all we can do is take the behavior and try to rationalize it and see a way in which we could impute beliefs and desires that would be consistent with the behavior, and that pushed him toward interpretivism. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that if you look at the data that we've been discussing all along, it suggests that actually we do have more information, because we have information about how the system represents expected value, how the system represents risk, and therefore we can actually meaningfully talk in terms of these categories in trying to impute psychological states to the agent. Now, of course, you could always say, well, we could reinterpret those in various ways, and that's quite right. But the challenge that Davidson faced wasn't the challenge of defeating skepticism about other minds. We could interpret their behavior some other way. But defeating the specific problem of trying to go from behavior to imputed mental states. And we now understand that we can do better than that, and we can predict behavior from these observed mental states. Okay, well, what I'm going to claim now is that we can use what we've done so far to talk about the problem of deliberate intention formation and action, and that we needn't take this as some kind of a primitive relation. And so in particular, I'm going to look briefly, and this is completely incautious on my part, but I thought I'd take advantage of the opportunity, looking at rule following, and I'm going to follow Wittgenstein's lead and head to a construction site. Okay, so here's the question of what carpentry can tell us about the structure of the normative realm. I'm going to claim there are three families of normative concepts. There are the regulatives, terms like norm, rule, law, right, wrong, correct, and so on, standard, canon, criterion. There are evaluatives, terms like, or concepts like value, good, poor, virtuous, vicious, beautiful, sublime. And there are deliberatives, ought, must, reason, rational, irrational, fitting, unfitting, deliberate, and so on. Okay, well, is there any way in which we can understand these concepts thanks to the building site where Wittgenstein took us? Okay, well, here's the original norm. So the original norm was the Greek's carpenter's square. And this enables us to understand what it is that the norm is supposed to be doing. So, for example, if you're a carpenter, you've got yourself a board, and some other carpenter somewhere else on the site cutting another board, and what you're supposed to do is cut them in a way such that they're going to meet together to make a tight joint. Well, you're over here and you've got your little norma, and he's over here and he's got his little norma. Ooh, his is a little bit dodgy. And so what you can do is you can apply that to the piece of wood, and what you'll do is you'll draw a straight line on its basis, like so, and he'll do the same thing, draw a straight line like so, and then you're going to cut the board. And if you've both used a good norma, then the boards are going to fit together and they're going to be tight. Now, suppose, being a careful carpenter, after you've cut, what you detect is that there's a gap. So here is the board that you've cut, and here is what happens when you put the norma on it, and what you discover is that there's this gap. Now the question is, what do you do in response? Do you think, the norma's wrong, I'm going to have to change this one and get a better one? Or do you decide the error is in my cut, and therefore remeasure, recut, and see whether they will indeed fit together? And so the thought is, by using the norma, we can, in this a priori fashion, coordinate our activity across the building site and fit together the work that we're trying to do in the manner desired. Here's the original rule. It comes to us from Regulus. Here's creation, and if you look very carefully at God's hand, you'll see that there is actually a little carpenter square there, as God is giving the rules to the world, because they are the norms. What are the origins of the words in the regulative camp? Nor, I said, it's a builder square. Rule comes from ruler or straight edge. Right comes from straight angle. Wrong from twisted. Correct from co-aligned. Standard for standing together or straight. consistent for standing together, ortho for straight, upright, criterion means a measuring rod, canon is a measuring rod. So these are all terms associated with a certain kind of tool, a measuring tool, which are such that if we jointly use the same tool, we can have a coordinated activity. And so these all involve a kind of standard or rule relative to which assessments can be made, and they can be made typically in terms of form. So we can assess sentences for well-formedness, logical validity of an argument. We can have a standard of measurement. And these are things that we can voluntarily hold ourselves to. We can try to observe the rules of logic or a language, and we can hold ourselves to that by making the rules articulate and applying them directly. If we do that, as I say, we can have a joint regulation of a project. We can communicate via a common language. We can do wonderful things like scientific and legal systems, organizing and regimenting the world in such a way as to enable us to have an extensive division of labor. So regulatives are very powerful, and having the capacity to explicitly, consciously follow a norm in this manner gives the human a tremendous advantage in its capacity to adapt to the larger world. Now, regulatives don't tell us what to do. Maybe they shouldn't be building a square house. Maybe in that location they should be building a round house. It would be more tight with respect to the wind. Regulatives don't tell you the answer to that question. They tell you how, if you've decided to build a square house, how you can regulate your activity so as to make it square. Okay, that means we need evaluatives. Evaluatives like value, poor, good, virtuous, vicious, and so on. And suppose we ask, what about these evaluatives? Where do we get those? Good comes from an Indo-European root meaning united or together. Value comes from a Scandinavian word for strength. It's a little bit unclear what's exactly going on here, but it's clearly a test of strength, and it's, I gather, the first labor of Hercules in a particularly imaginative reconstruction. Virtue comes from a word for male virility and power, and the protective character of the male, perhaps. And so these are the evaluatives. They have very common origins. They have to do with things like strength, virility, having heart, being firm, being together or united, having causal power, being favored, being lovely or pleasant. And so what are these? These are things not that we use to regiment our behavior, because we can't regiment our behavior in these ways. These are things that you want the people around you to have. They're assets that you want the people around you to have, the positive ones. The negative ones are those that you don't want to have in the situation. But a good friend isn't the one who's always correct, but the one who shows firmness of heart, solidarity, who favors and shows understanding. A fair marriage or a sublime sonata is not a matter of following strict rules. It's a matter of understanding the rules, understanding what it would be to be equal in division, but also understanding that that can't always work, and that sometimes that in itself is unfair or ugly. Okay, so evaluatives in use, then, you can't just assess them in some formal way. They involve a substantive notion of fit. Is this the right kind of house to build? Is this work of art one that's fitting to admire? Is a life in a zoo a fitting life for an animal? Is it, even if maybe it's better if it's the only alternative to extinction? These are all evaluative questions, and typically we don't have a set of rules or criteria that would suffice to determine whether these values are actually met, whether an idea or a mark or a house is good, worthwhile, important, or beautiful. Okay. Similarly, we can't attain these things by an act of will. We could apply the regulatives by an act of will, and that was very important. We can't, however, apply the evaluatives by an act of will in the same way. I can't just make myself beautiful, true, reliable, noble, all those things which I would like to be. I'm going to have to work my way to those things. Values are often open-ended. They're difficult to settle. They're usually a matter of degree rather than the kind of bivalence that you get with regulatives. And the fitting attitudes with respect to these aren't things like following a strict rule. They're things like admiring, appreciating, hating, liking, and so on. And those are motivating states, states that guide your efforts and actions, not just states that permit us to coordinate. Okay, and good examples of this is the difference between, let's say, legality, simply observing the law, and being respectful of the rule of law, where you care actually not just about legality, but whether the law is accomplishing its purpose. It's what Kant had in mind in distinguishing the doctrine of right, which was just obedience to law, observantia, from the doctrine of virtue, which is respect for the law, reverentia. Only the latter, he claims, is a real appreciation of the moral law or of others as ends. It's an evaluative attitude. It's non-voluntary. It's not a judgment. It's not a rule, he tells us. Okay, this is not about being a consequentialist or a deontologist. Each side needs to have regulatives if they're going to assess behavior. Each side needs to have evaluatives, as Kant, for example, has shown, if they're going to understand why it matters that we regulate behavior the way we do. Finally, deliberatives, ought, must, reason, rational, irrational, and so on. Given evaluatives and given regulatives, we've got the problem of how you put them together in order to guide action. What kind of a course should you set given the values at stake and given the ways in which you can apply regulation to determine a route or a possible constraint or a function that determines whether or not you're going to have enough fuel to make it to your destination. Okay, so here's a good example of a deliberative. This is libra, which comes from scales to weigh. And this is, I gather, the first known representation of the scales as a matter of justice. You can't quite see it, but this is a scale here. And on one side is the person's heart, and on the other side is a feather. And the idea was that if your heart was any heavier than a feather, this showed that you were not just, and the folks here on the side would be glad to take you to the underworld. Here's a more modern representation, which I quite like because it looks a lot like Jeff McMahon, and thoughtful like him as well. And here's what the word must comes from. It comes from a term for setting out boundaries, determining limits. The term rational comes from a root meaning to fit pieces together, in effect. And this is a 1940s puzzle of Europe directed at the British audience, in which they're trying to say, how can the English fit Europe back together again? So I suspect this to be out on the market soon. Okay, what about the origins of these words? I mentioned must and rational. Also, ought means to possess or be master of. To deliberate is to weigh. Merit is to receive a share. To decide is to cut off. To conclude is to close off. So these are the kinds of terms that we need, not to give us a measure of a strict formal criterion, not to be a notion of value, but to be a way in which we can operate to make decisions and conclude and weigh the different kinds of considerations that are in play. Okay, so finally, tools for thought. And here is my attempt to say something about rule following, using the understanding of rule that we've just developed, where rule is a regulative. Okay, so take that which we got at the construction site, the idea of a rule being a regulative, having the kind of character that it has and being able to play the role that it has in our practice. And now let's think about the problem of rule following. Now, people often talk about rules and norms in the same breath as if they were quite the same thing. But norms, often we don't know and we can't write down a distinctive rule for them. Consider, for example, English norms of conversational distance. There are, you have a little model of social situations. In that model, you will be comfortable or uncomfortable with different degrees of separation. If someone closes in past a certain point, you will attach a certain significance to that, which may not be appropriate given your relation to that individual. You'll therefore try to step back to correct the situation. So you have a norm of conversational distance. Now, we don't typically notice this until we go to another society. And we suddenly realize that people are putting their hands all over us and they're leaning on us and so on. And at first, it's very hard to feel appropriately in that situation because this is behavior that would be highly marked behavior in your own society. Eventually, though, you can habituate to this behavior, and then when you return back to England a couple months later, it seems like everybody's standing about 50 feet apart, and they're talking without moving anything except their jaw, and when they see you, they go, hi. So those are conversational distance and conversational greeting norms, and we learn those, but it's very hard to write down a set of rules that would govern them. So we can follow rules implicitly without being able to articulate them, norms implicitly without being able to articulate them, and while managing to do exactly what is supposed to happen with regulation. That is to say, to compare a situation with the situation that is standard for the circumstance, to see whether it fits or doesn't fit, and to generate some kind of a change in which the behavior is adjusted to fit the standard rather than the standard adjusted to fit the behavior. Okay, so you don't have to imagine a rule of some sort nested in your mind. It's enough if your model of ordinary social interactions assigns heightened significance to those being closer to an individual than a certain amount, such that you find yourself unable to avoid experiencing a certain heightened significance in that situation, and therefore a kind of discomfort that moves you to try to, as we would put it, correct the situation. This is not to say that it's correct to do that. That's an evaluative judgment if it's globally meant to be correct, but it's correct relative to the standards locally, and if you don't figure out those standards, you may get yourself in a lot of trouble in a hurry. Okay. You can see this very clearly. I have a terrible habit of leaving cabinet doors open. It's very dangerous for me because I always have the danger of standing up and hitting one of these things. If I notice that one day I closed the cabinets when I left the kitchen, I don't rush back to correct this by going and opening up the doors. So that's a habit of mine, but it's not a rule of mine. A norm of mine might be to punch my bus tickets when I get on the bus, because what you'll see is if I get on the bus and don't do it, I sit there uncomfortable until I can fight my way through the crowd to the punching machine. Okay, so most of us in a society acquire these implicit abilities to understand and follow norms and to regulate our behavior in accord with them. And notice that what's going on in these cases is not the self-conscious application of a rule. We might not have any such rule, and what's going on is really much closer to the kind of pattern completion that we find elsewhere in cognition. There is a certain pattern for a situation. The situation we're experiencing is out of accord with that pattern. That motivates a change, and that change is to bring the existing situation back closer in accord with that pattern. That's what your visual system is doing in filling in the field and then picking up only anomalies. Okay, so let's go explicit and start using explicit rule following. Now, one way we can do it is to say we can leverage our skill at using tools, like the carpenter's skill at using tools, to apply a tool via some kind of conscious deliberation, but not because his skill at using the tool itself is governed by a rule. If he has a skill at spotting situations where it's appropriate to use this tool, he has a skill at how to use it, how to apply it to the board, how to use it to check and measure, and so on. If he has the skill of coordinating with others in the building site, of deciding whether this is close enough or not close enough for the purposes at hand, they can work together in this manner. But that set of skills is not canonized as a set of rules. That set of skills is indeed a kind of global competency at using tools. And so here is my shameless appeal to authority for this week. I promise one each week. People may recall Wittgenstein's discussion of logic and rule following. Okay. Ramsey once emphasized in conversation with me that logic was a normative science. I do not know exactly what he had in mind, but it was doubtless closely related to what only dawned on me later, namely that in philosophy we often compare the use of words in games with calculi which have fixed rules. We can avoid ineptness or emptiness in our assertions only by presenting the model as what it is, an object of comparison, as, so to speak, a measuring rod, not a preconceived idea to which reality must correspond, the dogmatism into which we fall so easily in doing philosophy. So logic, then, is not necessarily laws of thought. It is a regulative model. It's a set of rules. In fact, it's a bunch of sets of rules because there are lots of different kinds of logic. And we can, in our practices, hold ourselves to those rules through our competency at using rules, our generalized competency at using rules, and in that sense, constrain our inferences and constrain our behavior in such a way that we can attain things we couldn't otherwise. So just as carpenters can attain coordination across a building site by using the norma, so we can in mathematical and scientific and everyday reasoning by constraining our thoughts, constraining our utterances and assertions via these rules, artificial as they might be, we can achieve results that are effective in a way that we couldn't just relying upon our intuition, just relying upon our intuitive and ordinary sense of a situation and what's appropriate. Okay, and mathematicians, like carpenters, have developed selective trust or selective interest in different types of rules or systems of rules. They debate about which rules are appropriate, what proof procedures are appropriate, how much confidence to put in those. And what they're doing is making decisions like the decisions that are made by any tool user to decide how it is to constrain their behavior. But they're doing that on the strength of an underlying skill that they've acquired as mathematicians. Okay, we must use cruel tools to make refined tools, and we have to develop a disciplined practice. We're moved to do this because we can see goods to accomplish thereby. It's not a blind process, it's an intelligent tool use, but it does treat the rule as a tool, and in that sense, it uses a capacity that isn't a rule-following capacity in order to deploy it effectively. And in order for us to deploy the rules of logic, we have to work very hard to do it effectively because we're trying to deploy it using a set of skills that are themselves not rule-governed, not guaranteed to work. They don't stretch as rails to infinity. As Wittgenstein tells us, it's a practice, not a set of rules. And so in that sense, then, what we need to do in the sciences is develop measures that are largely independent of human senses that can be reproduced reliably. We have ways of checking proofs. We have computer simulations or computer checking of proofs. We're trying to find ways of leveraging the informal means that we have through forms that can regiment our behavior in order to achieve more regularity in employing them. Okay, so beyond logic, we could do the same thing in law. We have these huge legal institutions where people are skilled or unskilled or devious in applying laws. That makes legal regulation possible. We have timekeeping, calendars, engineering standards. We have an infinite number of these regulations, and we are competent at handling them, not because we have an rule, a rule that stands behind them, but because we have applied and developed a competency with rules and therefore with self-conscious deliberation using them. And so as Aristotle and Hume and Kant and Wittgenstein have told us and tried to emphasize, we need a form of understanding that is sensitive to reasons. It is not deliberative rule application. In turn, this gives us a capacity to develop the skills needed for consciously deliberative rule following that then itself can be, like Ada's reasoning in her front corridor, appropriately reason sensitive, and that doesn't simply get in its own way. Thanks.